Hello and welcome to EyeOpener, powered by Siemens. On today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Falcini, Business Development Professional at Siemens, where we are going to be discussing what makes a good PDM project versus a bad PDM project. So big welcome to Ryan. If you could start off by introducing yourself to our audience, that would be great.
Thank you, Guggen. So as you said, I'm Ryan Falcini, Business Development Professional, and been with Siemens for just over a year since the integration, but been a part of the Sensei predictive maintenance organization for close to 4 years. So when I first joined, I was very much in the sales development representative role, where I would look to qualify opportunities, look to engage prospects on their interest in predictive maintenance. And the longer I've been with the organization, the more I've been involved in the development of opportunities from the start to the end, and also going into project management. So with regards to what makes a good project versus a bad project, been able to get more exposure and experience from my time being at Sensei and working with other colleagues who have also been involved.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining me on today's episode. And I guess let's get straight into the whole topic. So the first question I have really is around how would someone come about starting their PDM journey?
Well, the first thing a person or organisations will need to consider is what is predictive maintenance going to solve? So what is the challenge? What is the pain point precisely that they have? And not only that pain point, but it's being able to quantify it, because it's all good and well saying like, yes, we have a lot of planned maintenance or we have a lot of unplanned downtime. But if you don't know the numbers behind it, and that will help to really quantify the issue and really expose the size of the problem. Because for any organisation, you need to justify why you're going to do a project, why you're going to invest in this. So when it comes to really understanding, that size of the problem, that's going to be the biggest portion of work that's going to be needed for them. But it's essential that they do that, and that will be the beginning phase that they'll take to begin that predictive maintenance journey.
Okay. And do you do you believe I mean, from your personal experience, when someone does approach you to start their journey, is the main reason for them wanting to start based on the fact that they want to fix an issue that they're facing?
Sometimes, yes. I think this kind of builds into like that good and bad. So there'll be some people who really have a problem that they'll come and say, like, we've been getting killed by the amount of unplanned downtime is crippling our production, and we need to solve this problem. So those would be the good ones, where the pain point is just so intense and just unbearable that they can't move forward with the way that they're currently operating. Some of the bad ones, predictive maintenance is kind of like a vanity project. It's a really cool, snazzy idea.
Yeah.
The best way to put it. And when you say about the size of the problem, they can't answer that question openly. And in terms of like a red flag, and when you're having those initial conversations, that would become quite apparent then. So, what I would do is look to just try and probe and tease that out and see if there is a true understanding of what the problem is. Because like I said, like, yes, they say, oh yeah, we do have downtime, okay, but tell me about the size of the problem, like where is it specifically impacting you? Or like the planned maintenance, like why is that such a big problem? Really looking to ask and tease that out of people is essential.
Yeah, I guess the more information you know, the better.
Exactly.
And you need to do a deeper dive into all of that information, so you can actually determine what steps they need to take and what needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I want to do, is be able to ensure that when and if they begin the project, it will be successful. So, scoping it, probing them for those questions it's just a part of that process.
I guess that takes me into the next question around, what makes a good PDM project versus a bad PDM project. And, from your experience, Ryan, you'll be able to answer that in terms of experiences that you faced. And it'll be really, really interesting to see what that looks like from your perspective.
Sure. So I think I could go on this for about a good couple of hours. If I was to highlight, say, five areas, five topics that would be really important between a good and bad project, the first and most important one I would say is people. People are essential to this. Having an organisation that can devote the resources to predictive maintenance, to be able to give that time, be willing and open to learning, and also not stand there on the sideline. I think is really important, because from our side and delivering the projects, there's only so much we can do. We can't get the customer to just sit on the sideline and watch us, doing the hard work, doing the hard labour. It needs to be a collaboration, and the good projects, that the people will understand that it's 50% from them, it's 50% from us, and we're meeting in the middle. And like I said, with the resources, they'll have a good understanding of the resources that will be needed, making the resources available. But also, within organisations, people will leave, people will there'll be changes in roles, so some people may come and go. And it's also being able to allow people to be able to come in, to be able to fit into that project, and people wanting to really adopt that change management, to adopt new process, to be able to learn. So from that people perspective, it's super important to have the right people involved in projects. And I think if you speak to any delivery engineer within our organisation, they would say people will make their life easier, or they'll make their life hell.
Yeah.
The second part is the business case. Building a really good business case helps deliver that success criteria. It helps establish that success criteria a lot easier. So when it comes to measuring the impact of the project and the value that the project has brought, if you've built a really solid business case, you'll be able to identify and be able to determine that, say, in 12 months' time, after that first 12 months, on what value have we seen, have we delivered this success, have we achieved it, yes or no. And that comes in that pre-project kind of scoping, and back to that initial that initial, when they're beginning the journey, that's where it's so important to do it then, because it's a big factor in a project being successful, and also actually beginning the project. Whereas there's projects that have been done before, where when it comes to actually building that business case, and the organisation have thought they've calculated the business case correctly, we actually delivered the success well. But when it came to reflecting and reviewing, like, while we did hit the targets, that business case wasn't built properly, and it wasn't delivering the value that it should have. So that's where identifying that value and benefit before, and what predictive maintenance can actually bring to an organisation, is essential. Third is going to be high-level sponsorship, and initiatives that are pushed from top down are always more powerful. They're always more likely to be adopted. People are likely to be on board with it, and from a cultural perspective, if it's coming from the top down into the organisation, it's more likely to be able to stick, and people to really take it in. But also when it comes to I would say not only the initial deployment, but when you're looking to scale a project, the high level sponsor will be able to help negotiate the political boundaries of different sites, and enable you to be able to connect with the right people when you go from site to site. And in terms of that high level management, they can be your champion, they can be an extension of you within that organisation. And that's always important to have, because when you think about some of these huge organisations, you're not gonna be able to meet everyone, but they'll have those relationships established. So if you can have an extension of yourself from a high level sponsorship, that's doing a lot of your hard work, and makes your life so much easier. Fourth would be the project size and duration, and this is probably one that I come across a lot, in the sense of, when I'm having these initial discussions, people will say to me, and I'll say to them, what what size are you looking to begin with? Like how many like machines, how many assets would you look to begin with? And the good ones were always, that they're thinking big picture. That they're thinking we need a representative sample that will be able to show that the people to say proof of concept. I prefer proof of value because proof of value, we know the concept of the solution works. We've delivered it with multiple customers. But the proof of value for that organization, are they seeing value in this? Is it making an impact on their day-to-day work? When you have a good enough size and you have a large sample size, it's going to impact your day-to-day work, how you do your maintenance processes, how you do your activities. Whereas a small sample size, it's not gonna change anything. But if you're a maintenance user and you're just monitoring 5 assets, what is that gonna do to your day-to-day work? It's not gonna really impact it. And on the topic of size as well, the more assets you monitor, the more likely you're going to see failure. The more likely you're going to see degradations from those assets. So the larger the sample size, the increase in probability of that value being delivered, and that's what we want to do with that initial in that initial project, that initial kind of deployment that we begin with. And then from a duration size, minimum 12 months, and it's essential to do it over 12 months because the first 3 to 6 months you're really setting that foundation for a good project, and it's really important that customers understand it, and the good ones do. Because that those foundations will enable you to be able to scale. It will enable you to grow it across that whole plant, but then within the organization, using like a specified methodology, which I can explain a bit more about later, but those foundations are set over the first 3 to 6 months, and yes, you will see some initial value, but over that 12-month period, and when you go into like kind of 24, like 2-3 year period, that's when the predictive maintenance will really start to come through. That value becomes more evident from the sense of planned maintenance, being able to influence that, and the shutdowns that companies would have from spare parts inventories. That's going to become more evident, over a 12, 24-month period. So in terms of duration, they need to think about this more long term. There needs to be a long-term strategic objective to the predictive maintenance deployment. And then the fifth and final, will be a technical understanding. So what we mean by this is like a customer understanding what's a good sensor versus a bad one. I was actually speaking with one of the engineers a few days ago, and he did also mention this, where a good customer will understand, like with a good sensor you'll be able to get certain frequencies. That basically just means we can detect data more specifically depending on the frequency. But then I think also from a technical understanding, when we're going into projects, organizations who understand what data is there and what kind of failures they're experiencing, it will be able to allow us to really assess where any gaps are, and if there are potentially any red flags, we can do that then. And if they're normally quite open, transparent, the good ones. The bad ones would be where they don't really understand, but they want to begin the project. And when you do begin that project and you're looking to identify relevant data and potential failures, if there's that massive gap, then it delays that onboarding, and it delays the time that they're able to get value. So if they're able to do this prior to the project, and they need to, they'll be able to see value from PdM, predictive maintenance, a lot quicker.
Yeah. And Ryan, just touching on to the first point you made, so you made reference to people.
Yeah.
And I feel that, this is something which is underestimated, because when it comes to a PdM project, it's so important to build these relationships. And I guess the question that we seem to get asked quite a lot is around who are those key stakeholders when it comes to a predictive maintenance project?
Yeah.
And what does that look like to yourself?
So when we begin a project, in terms of these key stakeholders, we identify 5 key characters who will be essential in the deployment of the project, but then also taking ownership of it and being able to scale it themselves. Because our goal would always be for customers to take ownership of that journey. We want them to be autonomous, independent. So the first of which is going to be the project sponsor. They're going to be the one that's going to champion it, ensure that all the resources are being delivered to the customer, well, for the customer, I would say, and ensuring that it is moving smoothly on their side. And if there are any barriers, kind of politically internally, they'll be able to address that. And then you'll have a maintenance lead. So kind of as it says, they'll be responsible for like the delegation of the tasks. They'll be very much engaged with the platform and the cases that would be raised. So organizing that on the assets that are being monitored. You would then have like a PdM champion. This will be very much the strong day-to-day user of the application, and looking that they kind of work alongside that maintenance lead in terms of the information that's being raised for the predictive analytics. A controls engineer would be the fourth one. So they're really going to be like the machine specialist. They're going to have a lot of knowledge, expertise, which can be valuable for the AI machine learning to learn from. So their input's going to be vitally important with regards to any contextual operational data information that would be necessary to really understand about the machine and its process.
Yeah.
And then finally, we need someone from IT, like an IT engineer, and they're super important because they need to be able to push data to the cloud. So having them on board, and they need to understand that they're a super important part of that project and enabling data to go from where it is on the customer side to be able to push to the AI platform to do that predictive analytics. And that seems like a lot of people, but each member of that team will have different roles and responsibilities and time commitments throughout the project. So when you look at the kind of design phase, the IT person might not have a lot of input. Whereas when you go to the deploying, you're really looking to onboard assets, machines, and data into the application. The IT person is going to be heavily required. So from a time commitment, it'll be about 3-4 hours a week for say a month, 6-week period. It could be. But then for the rest of the project, they might need to do less than an hour a week. So one of the things that we look to really explicitly tell them is what their time commitments would be and when are they going to be most needed throughout the project in kind of like different phases.
Yeah. And I guess that's what makes a successful PdM project. You've got all of these key stakeholders who are involved, and they can bring they can bring something to the table. So they've got their own skills and expertise. And I think that's what kind of makes it fit and piece together.
Exactly, and they're able to collaborate together. That they're able to understand what their strengths are. How can they leverage other people's skills? For example, if there is an integration piece needed, then they know they can lean on their IT engineer a bit more. If they need some specific knowledge about that machine, they know they can lean on this person. And it's within a good project team, and from the people side of it, they can lean on each other when necessary, and also have that trust in each other to be able to do their roles and execute them efficiently.
Yeah. And I guess this alludes me to my next question, just around, you spoke about business case.
Yeah.
And when it comes to a business case, it will be really interesting for you to define what actually needs to be included into that, or what is included. So how is that business case, I guess, created? What's the main focus points around it?
Sure. So I guess with regards to the business case, first of all, a customer would look to do some kind of asset criticality assessment, where they're looking, okay, what's going to be the highest priority assets to really onboard. They can do this through kind of criticality to production, in terms of like maybe parts costs, maybe current unplanned downtime experienced, or if there's a certain group of assets that their like equipment efficiency is just very low. Organizations will do it in different ways, but when we come to actually building that business case, we want to understand what is the cost of, say, unplanned downtime per line, per an asset group, and in terms of like the maintenance cost as well, the what is the cost of actually the labour, the spare parts, and kind of hours that they're spending doing this planned maintenance. Going back to downtime as well, you not only the cost but also the amount of hours that they have for unplanned downtime on certain assets. And when you're able to look at, say, those costs per hour or per asset group, that really helps to identify in those initial stages where's that value, where's that benefit,
Yeah.
to initially beginning this project and really getting it up and running. So those would be the two main things that we can look to calculate. Like, yes, minor stops as well. Like, we can look to have a look at, for example, what assets or what lines may have like large minor stops. But I think through unplanned downtime, through the maintenance costs, and when you're looking at spare parts, etc., that will be what we will look to identify the value and benefit for an organisation, and to help guide them. And also, if the customer is able to do this prior to that, and if they have a lot of knowledge, it helps to speed up this process significantly.
Yeah.
So really being able to identify that allows them to then go internally and say, okay, we've identified, say, asset X and asset Y. We know, for example, the amount of unplanned downtime is this much, and the maintenance costs are this much. We feel that if we begin with these assets for this initial deployment, we can see some real immediate value, and it can deliver some savings to us as an organisation to, help us meet our quotas or, achieve our targets and goals.
Yeah. And I think it helps to define the goals realistically. I think that's what it is.
Exactly. So we have a set of criteria that we've used during projects, and that we don't see them as binary. Like, we always stress it's not binary, but it's what we want to measure it at when it comes to that 12-month period. And it's also important for them. Like, while we know what we can use the success criteria, we want them to be able to give their input. So in projects there's been a collaboration of a bit of both, right? So where some people will need, like, some companies will need guidance, we can push what we feel would be good success criteria, but we want that to be driven by them, and we want them to be happy with it. Because when you're getting 3-4 months into a project, you don't want people to be saying to themselves, why are we doing this? Everyone knows why we're doing this. Everyone knows what the benefits are of this, and everyone is aligned and moving in one direction to ensure that it can be successful.
Yeah.
And that's where, that kind of pre-defining phase is so important.
Yeah. And I completely understand why it is very important.
Yeah.
I mean, the question that I was going to ask you is, people make this assumption around ROI, and they want it so quick. They've got these assets and they want their downtime to be reduced significantly, and people make this assumption that this downtime is going to be reduced in the initial, couple months.
Yeah.
And I guess from your perspective, when you touched in, just going back to your point around duration, and I guess, when it comes to each PdM project, it's case by case. So it's not going to be kind of one size fits all. It will be different across industries and, asset types, etc. And so from your experience, when it comes to ROI, how have you seen that kind of play out, if that makes sense? So we have this initial period of time where you've got the business case, you're having these conversations, these are expectations, customers got expectations, we're working on how to reduce the downtime, step-by-step transition, right? But when it comes to ROI, what has that been from your perspective? How does that look like?
ROI is always a funny one, I think, because it's so important. It's how companies will measure, whether they're going to, continue scale project, and ROI is kind of everything for organisations. I think it's one where we have to manage that expectation very carefully. I think when we're speaking about, savings from unplanned downtime, from maintenance costs, we've had our experience with previous projects, and we know what some of the industry kind of standards are, but we always say this is potential. And it always is potential before you begin a project. ROI and potential savings from maintenance, reducing downtime, it's all potential. And I think that the good projects will really understand that it is just potential, because we can only do so much, and it comes back to that collaboration. If they don't buy in, that potential will not be realized. So it's a really interesting one. Like we can say, like, yes, if we're able to say conservatively reduce your unplanned downtime by 20%, that's still just potential. And when it comes to defining what's binary and what's not binary, it's always non-binary, because a lot of it's going to be on the customer on how they actioning that that information. Are they reacting it, or are they acknowledging it quick enough? So while we can say, like, yes, we can reduce your unplanned downtime by 20%, it's still going to be on the user to ensure that they're using that information correctly. And when it comes to, let's say, planned maintenance, we can say, like, yes, that machine is behaving healthy, but if you still go and do your maintenance, then we can't impact it. So RI is always like, yes, it's important, but I think it's, like you said, case by case basis, and trying to make sure you define it properly with them, and that the customer and the good customers will understand that it is potential. There's still a lot of work they need to do to be able to achieve it. But of course, from our side, like, we're always going to be accountable to delivering an RI, whether it's going to be, one time, two times, three times, in case of understanding that value and benefit. It's always going to be, if there's a high problematic asset, the ROI potential is always going to be greater on it than one that's not really failing. The maintenance is low. So this is where, like, that calculating what are the highest priority assets. If you're able to do that, then the ROI potential is going to be a lot greater, and it's going to be a lot easier to achieve, with what you invest in the project. So again, it kind of goes full loop right back to building that business case. Will help to, define what ROI can potentially be achieved. And I should emphasize the potential on that.
Also, it's a funny one, because when you, as soon as you hear the word ROI, return on investment, it's, I mean, the one way that I like to define it, it's a work in progress. And I guess when it comes to predictive maintenance, it is step by step. It's a transition.
There's a lot of value that you can get from, like, yes, you can calculate return on investment through unplanned downtime, through maintenance costs, but I guess when you look at, if you go and buy anything, like, and you always say to yourself, like, what am I going to get from this? Like, yes, you might get something tangible, but I think the non-tangibles is better understanding your machines, being able to understand what failures are occurring, how to do better, more precise maintenance. But then I think in terms of ROI, what price can you put on your reputation, your credit, like, kind of credibility, and being trustworthy to be able to deliver your product on time, and to ensure that you can meet those quotas. Like, what number can you put on that? I think there's a lot of intangibles that we help to impact just outside of downtime, outside of maintenance costs, that I think when it comes to delivering projects, like, in those first few months, people get it. People will see, oh yes, it's enabling us to really, be able to have all, like, a massive eye over our fleet of assets, and be able to see what's going wrong.
You touched on this whole, like you said, I think it comes back to this whole concept of learning and gaining more knowledge. So when it comes to your assets, and these can be different assets, different types, etc. From our perspective of coming in and, I guess, assisting with the predictive maintenance project, they gain all this knowledge into their assets, and they've got all this data, and essentially they start to understand it more, when before it was, hey, we just want to reduce our downtime, we just want to improve efficiency. But all of these other elements of knowledge and understanding what the issue is something that comes into the whole process too.
Because customers will be using that data in the right way. Like, there'll be some that will have loads of data there, but they don't know how to structure it, how to make the most effective use of it, and we can enable that. We can enable them to really be more concise in what they'll feed in for, like, a specific asset. But also, a lot of the problems that customers will experience will be for the first time. They won't really understand, like, what's going on, why is it failing the way it is failing. But with the use of predictive maintenance, it helps to just make them understand that better. It allows them to really see what is going wrong, and also how to do that process. And I think that journey that it takes someone from going from reactive or preventative to more predictive is really that change in mindset, change in that kind of, that change management, I should say.
So that takes me to my next question around, what are the key steps which need to be taken in order to achieve a successful PDM project?
Well, the first one's going to tie into the actual initiative itself, and what's the long term goal that you want to achieve with a PDM program. Because I think, coming back to some of the points earlier, it's not just 12 months, 24 months. You need to think of it as a long term vision. Does it tie into other areas in the organisation where improvement is going to be desired? So the first step is for customers to do some form of asset criticality assessment. Know where is your problem, where does that problem lie specifically, and I think from that perspective as well, if they know where that asset is, if they're able to quantify that issue, looking at the connectivity point of view, because I think with predictive maintenance, and any predictive maintenance kind of worth its value will require good data to be put into the application. So in terms of beginning that journey, I think there's steps that need to be taken from a connectivity point of view to ensure they are well connected assets, that they are able to get some data into the application. If not, if let's say data isn't there, it's still not actually the end of the world. We can, companies can help support providing that hardware to build that end-to-end solution, but that really needs to be figured out in those first steps of what is available, what is the current infrastructure you do have, and are you able to really automate it? Because doing some manual labor in terms of pushing that data is not going to be feasible long term. It's not going to allow you to scale. One of the things in terms of that early stage as well is looking at who are going to be some of the key characters, like who is going to drive this initiative. Is it being driven from the top down, or is it like driven from like a plant by plant basis? If it's driven from the top down, it's going to stick. It's going to be able to grow out, rather than trying to go from the down, like bottom up. Makes it a lot slower process. So in terms of those initial steps, those will be things that will need to be considered. Where do you want to be in 3 years' time? Where do you want to be in 5 years' time with predictive maintenance? How do you see that growing in your organisation? That's where you need to begin with, in terms of covering those issues, covering those topics, and that will allow you to really determine where you're going to begin. And I think that's one of the biggest things we have with customers, is where are they going to begin with this solution, like a lighthouse facility. So in case those who are listening don't know, a lighthouse facility is somewhere where it's more technologically advanced than other sites. It's got probably more data, it's got a good culture, and they're more open to adopting solutions. And generally, organisations will look to run like kind of new projects through a lighthouse facility, see how it develops, and then will look to expand it within the organisation. Because lighthouse facilities are generally seen as places for best practice, and they're really good in terms of actually working with the people, being able to understand the problems that are there. They generally have a good knowledge and understanding of this. So once you've done that, it then goes into that number crunching, because like you said, people want to know what is the ROI we're going to be able to get, or what are we going to potentially be able to achieve with this solution, and how is that solution going to look from end to end. So we've got the data from here, how we're going to be able to effectively and efficiently push it from A to B, A being their shop floor, B being like that, maybe that cloud platform or that predictive maintenance platform. So that's that initial scope that they would look to do. And once they've kind of identified, okay, we know what assets we've got, we know what how we're going to push that data, who's going to be involved, like from a project resources point of view,
Yeah.
and that will really build that kind of proposal, as you would, that not only can be presented to the business, but this is how you will be able to successfully implement a predictive maintenance project.
Going back to your point around good data, Ryan, how do you define what good data is?
So good data will be able to show any change in that machine's health, that machine's state, and I think good data will cover a variety of potential failures. So one of the things that will be done in that pre-sales process is really identifying, once the asset's identified, what failures are there, and
Yeah.
that will be able to map good data. If you've got a list of failure modes and then looking at what data is present, for example, if you're having an issue with bearings, okay, but you have vibration, that's going to be good data, because to be able to pick up any like bearing damage, as an example, you would need vibration data to be able to do so. So good data would be aggregated. It wouldn't be like raw frequency data. It's not going to be like every millisecond. You could aggregate it to maybe 5-10 minute intervals where you would see like a minimum, maximum kind of rate of change
Yeah.
within that data. And yeah, that will the data itself will just be very aggregated to show what's that machine's current health. Is it going to show significant signs of degradation?
Yeah.
And data can be in all forms. It can be machine data. It can be kind of process data as well. So if you have something like a machine like cycle time as well can be something that can be valuable, because if the cycle time takes too long, it may show there could be like a blockage, or there's an issue with the process that is actually happening. So there's a wide variety of data that can be used, and I think it's one of the things that a good organization will look to qualify and look to understand that data available and what can be kind of utilized, and maximizing that existing infrastructure.
Yeah.
So there are some things that can be done, but I think it's a bit of a case by case basis, depending on the machine, the industry, the process itself. Like we know as an organisation, for example, for a gearbox or a motor, what kind of measures would be good to be able to give full coverage, but there may be some assets that you need to probably look at, say, process data, some contextual information that can really help to feed into it.
So, Ryan, from your experience, what's made a successful PDM project?
So I think you could break that down into 5 components. So being able to scope the project properly, making sure that there's value and benefit, and you've identified the objectives and constraints for the customer.
Yeah.
Then you go into the design phase, and you're looking at the asset selection, identifying relevant data, potential failure modes to kind of go with that. Looking at the kind of deploy, so actually making sure that you're onboarding the right data, the right assets into the Sensei platform, being able to ensure that the connectivity from the shop floor to your application it is stable, is quite seamless. And then like the operate phase is where the customer actually get quite a lot of support in terms of case reviews, information that's being raised from the platform, making sure that they're able to understand it, and being able to configure the application to their needs. So really, just doing those small minor tweaks, and then refine. So you actually, the previous 4 steps, you're actually going to be completely refining that over and over, and think of that as a continuous loop. So you're looking at how can you further integrate with their workflows, any integrations like with a maintenance management system, what does like that ROI look like in terms of scaling as well. You'll look to really define that in the refine phase, and then that will kind of loop back to the design. Then you go through that consistently, and with customers, the best ones will be able to, once you get to that refine phase and you go back to the design, they'll be taking over that design. They'll know how to do that asset selection. They'll have that knowledge, experience, and skill set to manage it independently.
Yeah. I agree with your point of this whole continuous cycle. I think that's what it is when it comes to a predictive maintenance project. It is a continuous cycle, because this is, you know, a lot of our customers have these long-term goals, so they're forecasted over the next couple years. And once you mentioned about the refine stage,
Yeah.
again, you're going to go back because you know the process, and each and every time it's going to be work in progress, and you're developing what the issues are, and most importantly, understanding the reason why you've got these issues in the first place.
Yeah, I think speaking to probably one of our longest term customers in terms of that process, they they have been able to really adopt those stages themselves. So, like, yes, initially they ran through it with us, but now they take ownership of that. And when it comes to that, speaking about ROI and the cost of projects, they've actually eliminated a lot of those costs in projects because they take ownership of, choosing those assets, make sure that the data is right, onboarding those assets into the application. Where they take kind of complete ownership of it, they've been able to scale globally, over 10,000 assets, multiple sites, and now they just pay for a license, and all you can eat license. So where they've been able to show really great maturity and take ownership and be independent with that, like, yes, we gave them those initial skills, and they've kind of taken it and managed it themselves. So
Yeah.
it's when an organization gets on board, it's so powerful.
So, Ryan, on our previous episode, Nathaniel Ford asked a question for our next guest on the show. And that question is focused around, given the rate of technology, how do you see your job role evolving?
Well, I think with technology, it's allowed us to be able to communicate with people on the other side of the world, to actually be able to deliver projects without ever seeing someone. I think with technology, you can speak about AI coming in, and there's so much information that's still accessible to people, like on the internet. You can kind of pull up something like ChatGPT, and you can look for things such as predictive maintenance. But I still think, in terms of my role, people would want to buy from people, and they always have, and I still think that would look to continue. And actually, in terms of understanding the solution, it's still going to be within my role. I think it will evolve in terms of how AI, machine learning that will evolve. So my job is still going to be to keep pace with it. But in terms of actually communicating that to organisations, to people, I still think that's going to be like an essential part of it. So maybe the technology itself will change, and how I actually go about communicating that to customers might change. But I still think the biggest part of my job is to be able to build trust, to be able to manage relationships, to be able to help them understand that the benefits and value that a solution can bring. And I don't see that changing immediately within maybe the next 5 years, maybe 10, 15. Who knows? I think probably if you spoke to Nat on what it was like maybe 20, 30 years ago, he I think he might have seen it evolve quite significantly. But I think I'm quite fortunate to be in that generation where we've been exposed to the development of technology. So actually keeping up with it, I think, is much more easier for my generation than maybe it's, say, for older generations. Not that they haven't done a good job. I know plenty who have been able to do amazing things with it. So I think it won't change too much in the immediate term. But I think with things such as COVID happening, it's allowed us to be able to do stuff more remotely. But the importance of us getting in face to face with people is still going to be paramount. That we'll still need to go and see people, visit sites and whatnot. So the core elements of my job, I think, will still remain.
Yeah.
And then I think for a question, right? Do I have to do a question for the next person?
So for our next guest on the show, Ryan, if you could ask a question, what would it be?
So I did touch on it just then. ChatGPT. How dangerous do they feel ChatGPT can be to job security, and job roles, and it'd be interesting for them to say what job roles do they think specifically will suffer from this emerging technology.
Very interesting question, and I think it's been the talk recently, hasn't it? So
it has. I think there's been so much. It depends if you're on TikTok. You know, you can look on the internet, and there's so much, and they kind of say what's the what's the worst thing that could happen from like these AI like bots, and you know they're saying the worst case scenarios, because it's not really regulated at the moment. If
yeah,
if that AI kind of starts to develop, if it's able to manipulate people without people kind of realizing, that's when it can become dangerous. But yeah, I know there is a debate in itself on the regulation of.
so thank you so much, Ryan, for joining me on today's episode. I think it's been great to dig into the whole topic of what makes a good PdM project versus a bad PdM project, and really appreciate your insights into this topic.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to always speak about and to create some awareness for people who are looking to potentially adopt this and are looking to begin that journey themselves.
Big thank you to our audience for tuning in on today's episode. Please stay tuned for the next one in the series. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and yeah, see you soon.